Okay, so greetings everyone. I think the first thing you might have heard was recording in progress. So, I mean, this is just to let you know, those who are here now and those who are going to join us, that we do record these sessions and we do share them later in a fairly unedited format on our website. Just briefly to take you through what we have in store for you today. This is the third and final part of 3 workshops on social justice education, which are anchored by John Portelli. And if we have to look at the general scheme of things, how we're going to go ahead, I think I'll give you some introduction about how these webinars fit together. So for those of you who have joined us before, please bear with me. John will then do some scene setting, and I also introduce the panelists. There's enough time for some Q&A, and then normally John wraps things up. John is also, besides being a Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, is a chair of the 3CL Foundation, which is a foundation that I run. And again, this is not an eye test, I promise you. It's just simply a quick mind map that I had drawn to explain to people quickly what we do. The 3CL Foundation was set up in 2017. It was set up as the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning. We've just rebranded to call it 3CL Foundation, with really the focus being on critical communication and connected learning. And we really do 4 things. We're in the business of edtech, really. So we conduct edtech research. We consider ourselves as being, at the forefront of doing some edtech training when it comes to very focused things. Pre-COVID, we were running high-profile conferences and summits in Malta and in other places in France and in Brussels. COVID literally made us repivot everything like everything else. So most of the work we're doing right now is online. We live in hope that in 2022 we'll go back to being on the road again, and not necessarily just in Malta, which is what we happen to be, but wherever we're needed, really. We're involved in running edtech projects. We have a kind of relationship with the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver. In fact, this is a webinar which is being held in conjunction with the Commonwealth of Learning. For those of you who don't know, Commonwealth of Learning is one of the oldest online organizations worldwide. I guess it was set up in the 80s as a result of a CHOGM meeting in Vancouver, and we represent COL in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have working relationships with the ILO, where we're looking at projects primarily in Africa and developing countries. We do quite a bit of work for the EU. We're currently running a Horizon 2020 project, which is also looking at the impact of emerging technologies on the future of education. And I guess where this one fits in, where this webinar fits in, we look at our role in capacity building. Again, operating out of Malta, but all of our work really is outside Malta. But we happen to think that small states are particularly good at either being test labs for new ideas, or also as ways of sometimes partnering up together geopolitically to look at the bigger issues in life. So small states, social justice and education, and we have an expertise in digital and media literacies. And we've just published a book right now on the post-truth society, on the kind of situation where, where we're looking at whether education, media and technology are now forces for good or forces which are making our life a bit more complicated. So that's where the 3CL Foundation is. It's pretty much a small foundation based here, and we're constantly looking to partner up with other entities, individuals, professionals, academics who are interested in doing project work wherever these hits any of these things that I'm sharing with you right now. Okay, so I can stop sharing my screen now, and I'd like to hand things over to John. So John, in your good hands.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome all again, because I welcomed you on the chat. My name is John Portelli. As Alex said, I am a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, just retired a week ago, and also have been chairing the board of the 3CL. As Alex has very well noted, 3CL operates as a knowledge hub for global network of groups, agencies, institutions, educators, and activists. And today, the emphasis is on activism. The general title of these 3 sessions is Social Justice Education Post-COVID-19, Implications for Education with a focus on the African continent and the Middle East. The aim of these 3 sessions in general was to provide a forum with the involvement of international scholars and activists in education who solidly work with a robust notion of social justice education. And no apologies at all for working with a robust notion of social justice rather than a soft neoliberal understanding of social justice. With a focus on reflection on the African continent and the Middle East, and therefore we do have in each panel representatives who have worked or continue to work both in the African continent and in the Middle East. All of these activists work from a critical pedagogy or an anti-oppressive or a decolonial or anti-colonial perspective, and they have been invited to reflect on the topic and share their insights based both on their scholarly work and, of course, also their activism. The focus today is on social justice, education, and activism. The first session, we reflected on the notion of social justice education and its implications both for practice and intellectual work. In the second session, we reflected on social justice and educational leadership with a focus on the different understandings of leadership and its implications from social justice education. The focus today is on social justice, education, and activism. The well-known educator from Brazil, Paulo Freire, wrote, quote, "Critical reflection on practice is a requirement of the relationship between theory and practice. Otherwise," he continues, "theory becomes simply blah, 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 and practice pure activism." This is the perspective from which we work with. The symbiotic relationship between theory and practice. Today, we are focusing on activism, but taking the lead from Freire's own work, we have to be careful that activism does not become blind. It is not blah, blah, blah. And I know from the work of the 4 participants today, their activism is solidly rooted in their intellectual work as it should be. The major question then for the questions for the panelists are, what about the role of activism in the community and the academia post-COVID-19 and keeping in mind the context where they work? What forms of activism are more worthwhile and sustainable? And finally, what insights or recommendations do they have given the activism work they are involved in? The first speaker is Dr. Moyo Raino Mutamba, currently a lecturer at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Moyo is a lecturer in social work with an emphasis, of course, on social justice, diversity, and inclusion, and also on indigenous studies and diversity, equity, decolonization, And he is also an inclusion consultant with Bloom Consulting in Toronto. His research interests are in indigenous epistemology, particularly to the African concept of Ubuntu, social justice, decolonization, and community engaged learning. He's also very much interested in experimenting with creating land-based communities of practice. And to this end, he founded the Ubuntu Learning Village and the Ubuntu Free School in Zimbabwe, which is his original homeland. He currently lives in Toronto. He has recently finished a doctorate also in education. And Moyo is a first-class musician. He plays mbira music, which is an indigenous instrument from Zimbabwe, and of course is very fond of telling stories in communities he is part of. Moyo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Portelli, for the introduction and also for the invitation to be part of this wonderful panel and also part of this timely conversation. I will address the questions of social justice education in the Zimbabwean context. And I choose to focus on Zimbabwe today because that's where I do my work with community in early childhood education, as well as adult education. I will draw on that work and specifically the work of Ubuntu Free School and Ubuntu Learning Village to speak about the centrality of community mobilization and activism in addressing inequality in education. So what I've done is I just divided my brief share or contribution into 3 parts. And I'll just summarize. I won't go into deep storytelling. So the first piece is I want to address the broad issues of systematic inequality in education in Zimbabwe. And the second is address the implications of these inequalities. And then the third, I'll draw on the work of Ubuntu Free School and Ubuntu Learning Village to propose some community-based solutions to addressing these inequalities. So COVID, which has affected the whole world, has also exposed inequality in education in Zimbabwe. It has also exacerbated those inequalities because the inequalities existed before COVID showed up. I'm just going to share with you a few characteristics of the Zimbabwean education system so that you have a clear picture of the types of inequalities that exist right now. So the first characteristic is that the Zimbabwean education system is very stratified. What that means is there are multiple classes of education to serve economically differentiated learners. So we have a class, an education system that serves the interests and the children of people who are wealthy. And those schools have infrastructure, have excellent educators, and also they tend to then have their students do foreign exams. So they'll do, for example, Cambridge exams instead of the local ZIMSEC exams. Right? And then we have another class of, or another education system that serves the majority of the impoverished people. And these are the schools that you find in rural areas. These are the schools that you find in slums of Harare, for example, in Bari. And those schools tend to have very substandard facilitators, not enough resources, and they tend to then take local ZIMSEC exams. So if a student, for example, takes the British Cambridge exam, they have better chances of accessing employment. They have better chances of being accepted to international universities, right? Whereas a student that takes the local exams, it's frowned upon, it's considered low quality. Sometimes there is, corruption, et cetera, associated with the examination. So it's not taken as seriously. So you already see that this two-tiered system of education has an impact on the outcomes, on the life outcomes of the people, of the students involved. The second characteristic is that it is colonial. And it is colonial in the sense that it does not find its inspiration from indigenous knowledges. It does not use indigenous languages. So whereas I grew up speaking Shona, we have Ndebele, we have Shangani, we have Tonga, and many local languages. The education system is taught mostly in English. Now, there is a new competence-based curriculum that suggests to educators to use indigenous languages for early learning. So from kindergarten to about grade 2. And then this just started taking effect in 2020, right? But from grade 3 onwards, the expectation is the delivery of education is in English. It is also very much neoliberal in the sense that the students are expected to pay. There is a new amendment to the Education Act that took effect in 2020, which suggests that children should have access to free education in Zimbabwe, and that the government should actually be responsible for providing that free education. But that is not happening in practice. Okay. It is also a neoliberal in the sense that the main aim of education right now in Zimbabwe is very much instrumental. The aim being the objectification of children to meet the labor needs of a neoliberal society, as opposed to the aim being to create conditions for people to live a healthy and equitable life. Methodologically, the education system is very much authoritarian. So the teacher knows it all. The teacher has tools to enforce their power, tools such as corporal punishment. They also use a banking model of education. And that has a lot of consequences. And some of the consequences are, there is a very low success rate in the exams. For example, this year, the pass rate, the national pass rate in grade 7 exam was about 37%. Right? And the O-level pass rate was about 40-something%. So very low pass rates, because the education system itself is not actually built to be just and to encourage learning. And part of it is because students are judged by exams, right? 3-hour exams, and that determines whether you can get a job or not. A lot of students struggle with mental health when they are in the education system because it is not actually conducive for a healthy learning. So those are the personal consequences of this education system. Interpersonally, class oppression continues, right? People who are wealthy continue to run society, and people who are less privileged continue to stay at the bottom of society. They basically become the base of this pyramid of society. But that also has an economic impact on the general society, right? If you have an education system that does not support full, healthy, equal participation of all its citizens, it means that they're not actually able to contribute to the economic success of a country, right? So let's think about students who cannot pay to go to school. They're already cut out, right, of learning opportunities, of access to relationships and networks that support their participation and contribution to the country. We also exist in a global reality, right, where we are no longer just Zimbabwe. We are Zimbabwe in the context of the world. And what we notice is that the few people who have access to this education that is more robust end up going outside of the country.
Moyo?
So we already have a problem of brain drain.
Excuse me, Moyo, just to let you know, we have 3 minutes left. Thank you.
3 minutes left, yeah. All right. So I'm gonna I'm gonna cut short. So with this new move towards online learning, right, Zimbabwe is actually not positioned to do it well because there isn't infrastructure. The system itself requires a rethinking to get to a point where it can actually provide e-learning for everybody. There are some potential solutions. So when we talk about social justice education, in education, we're talking mainly about 3 things. The first is social justice in education itself, which is the level of equality within the actual education system, right? And the second is education for social justice, which is that the content of what people learn is for the purpose of achieving justice. And the third is social justice in the methods of educational delivery. So we're talking about pedagogy. And in responding to this call for social justice education, I started a learning village, which contains a school. So the learning village focuses on adult education, where adults learn about skill sets, capacity building. And then the school is for early childhood education. So we have about 50 students right now. And it is run by the community. It is owned by the community. The students, the learners do not have to pay anything. They are also fed. And we have the support of a global community. So you can see that social justice in education can be achieved through creating experimental spaces that are translocal, but with the support and consciousness of the entire globe. I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muthemba. So you reminded us first that the COVID situation has made the inequities more explicit. You gave us many examples of how this is the case within the context of Zimbabwe, but you have not lost your hope. As a good activist, informed by your intellectual work, you have opened up spaces of possibility through the Learning Village School. And there may be more questions and comments on that as we continue the discussion. Thank you. We move now to Dr. Haneen Majdali from Bakr al-Arabiya in the center of Israel. Dr. Haneen is a Palestinian scholar and educator, social worker, and social activist. She was born in Bakr al-Arabiya, and for the last few years, she has lectured at Al-Qasimi College of Education in Bakr al-Arabiya itself. And prior to that, she worked for 4 years at the Jerusalem Foundation's as the director of program development in Jerusalem itself, in which capacity she led programs in education, health, welfare, and other areas. In the past, Haneen directed the Center for Citizens' Rights in Jerusalem, and she was also one of the founders of a non-profit organization working to promote volunteerism among Palestinians in Israel. Dr. Majdali holds a PhD degree in philosophy, and she has also graduated from the Mandel School for Leadership Education. Haneen, has won several local and national awards for her activism, and she very well deserves these awards. I have seen Dr. Haneen in action in her work, and Haneen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel honored to be here, surrounded with people who create the word and look at it differently. So thank you for this opportunity. And I was listening to Mutamba and like thinking, how far is that, but how close is that? Without sharing the same language, without sharing the same history, I find a lot of similarities. And this is like lead me to what I wanted to share with you. And I wrote it down to make sure that I don't forget any single example that I wanted to brought. So I wanted to share like my personal story with the social justice and how I become a social worker and after that educator. And this is what you mentioned also, Mutamba. So for me, social justice is what brought me to be an educator and activist. I was born and raised in Baqa al-Gharbiya, which is a Palestinian city located in the center of Israel. Mixture of identities, a lot of obstacles, and being a Palestinian is very hard. Being a minority is very hard, especially when you go to school. And I wanted to show you also Baqa al-Gharbiya, by the way, to make it a bit closer, and you are welcome to. This is my city. I live in the center. When I say a Palestinian city in Israel, it looks differently, though I hold the Israeli passport, but we don't have the same budgets. We have the same law, but laws sometimes treat us differently. In Baqa, my city, I started to be aware of just language from a very young age. By a young age, I mean 11. Then my parents, both educators, wanted me and wanted for my siblings a good education. So they worked very hard to send us, me and my brothers, to a private school, which was far away and very expensive. Imagine a girl, 11 years old, because her parents wanted a good education, used to travel in daily basis, wake up very early at 5 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour drive for a good school. And they work very hard to do so. I remember my parents talking about opportunities and equity, talking about budgeting to an Arab Palestinian student in Israel, talking about my possibilities in the future. From a young age, I understood that they did their best to build a better future for me, but I also learned that I was lucky to have them. And there are hundreds my age lack this luck. I came from an indigenous minority that struggles for a social justice. So I can say that this struggle is part of my identity, and it shaped the way I think and the way I act. I developed the language of equal rights and equal opportunities to all, and an ability of seeing the silent voices. I believe this is what brought me to be a social worker later on. Like 8 years after the school, those discussions with my parents, thinking about the rights, my right to be in a good school, having the same budget, having the opportunity. Actually, that was led me to be a social worker after that. Without calling it back a social justice, I understood that me, my family, and my community are part from a bigger struggle, distributing resources fairly. And of course, I'm mentioning here the Palestinian minority and being in Israel as a state. I believe that many of us are one way or another part of this struggle. And here I'm looking like my colleague here in this panel. As I mentioned before, Mutamba, we're like in different parts of the world, yet we have the same questions and the same struggles. Well, it's differently, but we share a lot. It's a common language of social justice. But for me, it's like it's a question of awareness, terminology, and hope. And you also mentioned hope, Mutamba. And I will explain. No one wants to be treated as a type B person, and it's better sometimes to deny that we are treated this way. So we choose not to see and then not to do. I mean, we we reconcile with the injustice and take it for granted, and then it's become our reality. We are not aware of what social justice stands for. For terminology, as I mentioned before, we don't call the phenomena by its name. We don't know it's a social justice, yet we see and feel and suffer from the same gaps. Language creates reality. I believe when we don't know how to call it, we don't know what it's and what we can do with it. Plus, how far this terminology from our cultures. And we're here, I'm looking here now, we're coming from different cultures and background. So I'm thinking also loud and clear with you, what is that social justice stands for your own community? Is it different between me, between Mutamba, between Joan? Thinking about Switzerland, Malta, Palestine, Zimbabwe, is it different? So which kind of words we use? As I mentioned before, language creates reality. I believe when we don't know how to call it, we don't know what is that and what we can do with it. Addressing any issue and giving it a name, it's part of any solution. You need to know what you are struggling with. Then you might ask, what is hope related to all of this? Hope, or more precise, losing hope, it's one of the most dangerous things, especially for oppressed people. If there is no hope, there is no thinking about better tomorrow. There is no way to visual what our just tomorrow look like. By not having hope, we simply stay where we stand and the gaps will get bigger. And that's exactly what why I become an educator after many years in the field of social work. I remember the exact day I said to myself, I want to be an educator. Back then, I visited the Palestinian school in Jerusalem. I couldn't believe what I saw back then. Dark rooms, there is no light, there is no air, broken chairs, windows, not to mention the washroom. And so I'm going to show you just one photo. It's a public school located in the old city of Jerusalem. So I couldn't handle the school. I couldn't handle how a child should be, like his future, how it could be a future that brings hope. I could see that there is no hope and that those children might have no opportunities in the future. They were playing, smiling, and I was imagining if they could have the tools to change their reality, how that would look like. I believe education can be a tool for social justice. We don't come and just teach subjects. We teach human beings. Students come to the classes with their identity. They come from a context. They come with their own struggle. And this is why I teach. Believe me, many educators in schools and in the academia, sometimes they think we are far away from identities, language. We are far away from the real world. When you come to teach, you teach your subject and it's not related to your history or where you came from. And it's totally the opposite. Education must be relevant to all what happens around us, outside our schools and academia. Schools and academia are places that can teach the skills and the tools to be active and engage in the community, and then to change reality and hopefully the world. Critical thinking, problem solving, asking questions are the tools that we already use. We need just the right context of social justice. Think with me for a second. When you imagine a teacher, educator, a tutor, we have the language, but sometimes as educators, we have this fear of like bringing the discussion or the case of social justice. We're afraid of that. So before COVID-19 crisis, they hold the strategy of teaching about social justice by raising awareness, using the terminology, talking about the theme itself, addressing the issue, talking more about social justice and using this terminology, and creating hope, thinking how we can, as Palestinians, have better tomorrow through education and through thinking critically about our present. And then we had, as everyone had it, COVID-19. The crisis was hard for all of us, humankind. We of course, we're not over it yet, unfortunately, but some communities suffer more. all over the world, by the way, but I could see it also locally.
Hello,
Yes,
Haneen.
yes, yes,
Sorry to
John.
interrupt you. Just to let you know, you have 3 minutes left, more or less. Okay, thank you.
Okay, okay. The crisis was hard, but like I could see like more people suffer in specific communities. We could witness how social justice issues are present, loud and clear. There is no place of denial. We could see how many of our students don't have access to internet, to electricity, parks, healthcare, and more. I could see that in my class in the academia and in school. And of course, like we're in a place that you think or imagine, and you want to convince yourself like you're far away from those cases, but it's not. So crisis of pandemic actually brought social justice to the front, to the shore. It's simple. If you were oppressed before COVID-19, you will be even in a harder place after. Your chances of surviving it personally and as a part of a community are very low. Then the crisis was turned to be an opportunity. I was thinking to myself, Haneen, you choose to be an educator. You know this language. It's about time to act. And I was thinking how we could, as a Palestinian community, to rethink social justice in the shade of pandemic. It's not a theory. It's not the skill. It's not the way that you choose the terminology. It's your life now. And so you're bringing the discussion of many years about social justice to the front. Now you see it, you're in the front door, and you have your pupils, your students suffering from that now. So it's not far away. It's brought to our classes. I admit first week I was paralyzed. I couldn't move or do anything. But sometimes crisis makes us see things differently. I used what I used before and started to bring to the classes. I'm talking about academia and the school. And I asked my students to write reflections about their daily life in the pandemic. And I want them to answer those questions. Who makes decisions? Who's left out? Which voices we hear? Who benefits and who's not? Who suffers? Who's responsible? And what we can do about that. So we're practicing through the pandemic. We have discussion in the classes, thinking, reflecting, discussing, talking, and sometimes crying together. And that made us make us like think about terminology. We're taking that few steps further, which means being an activist. We have the ability to understand the situation. We have the ability to analyze it. We already did that before the pandemic. Now, because it's very close, we can do something in the field. So we started to volunteer as students and as academic staff. We went from our safe classrooms and started to help the community by volunteering, by teaching, closing the gap, translating a lot of information from Hebrew to Arabic. And I wanted to show you one thing. Small things brought a lot of change. You see here, we have kind of small books of books that we shared in the neighborhoods. That was the idea of the students. It's thinking about, we don't have a library, so let us just bring a library, create a library. And I wanted to say another thing. This is my grandmother, and she used to be, she passed away. She was an illiterate. Do you remember that I told you that we have a terminology, which is sometimes Western terminology? It's not an Arab, Palestinian, Zimbabwe, or whatever. It's not my language. But I remember her clearly telling me, if I feel okay in my home, and my neighbor is okay in his home, and the other neighbor is okay in his home, we are a community that's sharing, a good community that is safe, protecting each other. And she was an activist, though she wasn't illiterate. So we have to bring our tradition and history to our classroom, and that would be very helpful for us, and also to be a model for our students, not just to think or talk or discuss theory. It's like bringing yourself, your stories to the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haneen. Once again, several points that echo Mutamba Moyo's reflections. but you emphasize two important points: the whole issue of personal experiences and identities and the struggle from childhood. And then, of course, the power of naming, but you don't stop with naming. You emphasize the rethinking, which leads to the activism and the volunteerism, even within your own classroom and going outside of your classroom, notwithstanding the conditions of the pandemic. Another exercise of courageous activism. Thank you very much. Before we move to the third speaker, I want to remind the audience, the participants, that we do have questions and answers section where you can write. You can also write comments or questions to the panelists on the chat. We have already started receiving some questions, and this is what is reminding me to make this notice. The next person is another person I know very well. I know all of the participant speakers very well. Dr. Kizoba Imoka from Nigeria. And after finishing her PhD at the University of Toronto, she's now back in Nigeria. Kizoba is an award-winning educator, a very experienced educator with education reform strategies, and an acclaimed social justice advocate and practitioner. As an education reform strategist and as an independent education consultant, she has worked with a wide range of organizations, including USAID funded projects and the Nigerian government, to localize SDG 4.1.1 and to strengthen education systems and create more inclusive education spaces. In Nigeria, she helped create the National Reading Framework, which is an adaptation of UNESCO's Global Proficiency Framework on reading. Currently, she is consulting for MasterCard Foundation on Youth Engagement in Africa and directs the NGO Unveiling Africa Academy, which is spearheaded efforts to promote African-centered history education and culturally relevant education reform in Nigeria. For her both intellectual work and also for her activism, Kizoba has won several awards, including in 2021, the very prestigious Canadian award, Ernest D. Morel African Diaspora Emerging Scholar Award. On a personal note, I should also add that Kizoba, while a doctoral student at the University of Toronto, in a celebration to honor an award which the University of Toronto gave her, and rightfully so, she was not afraid in public, in her professional way, to challenge the president of the University of Toronto with regard to systemic racism in Canadian universities. Kizoba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Portelli, for the introduction and the invitation. Hearing Dr. Mutamba speak and Dr. Hanning speak, I felt like, oh my God, I'm in good company. So thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I tried to find a perfect quote to explain my entry point into activism. I wouldn't even describe myself as an activist, but I think I found myself in there, given my sustained rage about the contradictions in the world. And so I have a quote here from one of the researches I did as a master's student, which really for me epitomized the contradictions that I found in my own personal life as a student in Nigeria, vis-a-vis the expectation of young Africans to transform their continent and not be at the mercy of the world to provide aid and saving for them. So this is a quote from a young girl who went to a school in South Africa, a school called African Leadership Academy. And I think I asked her to reflect on the difference between the school she was coming from and this new school that is focused on leadership in South Africa. So in explaining how she felt during an exercise that she was given, this is what she said. The exercise was about placing African countries on a map of Africa. So she said, I'm like, I know there's a Mozambique somewhere. And you know, I think I put Kenya in an awkward place where South Africa was supposed to go. It was really bad. I remember having a Malaysia there somehow. So my knowledge about Africa was almost at a zero level. I was embarrassed. And at the same time, I was like, wow, so this is how I grew up. So this young girl's explanation about what she learned and did not learn about the African continent. She's here telling us she was just 17 or 18, ready to go to university. And she could not name all the African countries in the continent. She thought Malaysia was an African country. So this shows you, and I think confirms what Dr. Mutamba was talking about, the colonial nature of schooling in Africa. So this isn't just a Zimbabwe problem. It's not just a Nigerian problem, it's an Africa-wide problem. And this was something that I came into a wild realization of when I was doing my doctorate, even though my interest in social change began when I was 17 years old, because I started to meet many white Canadians that wanted to save Africa, wanted to change Africa by doing fundraisers where students had to raise $5, $10 to buy goats in Africa. And so I started to question, how is it that white Canadians are being taught to save us on the continent? Meanwhile, students on the continent are not learning enough about the social issues that they are being faced with. Many of us are just schooled to pass our exams, which will enable us to leave the country if our parents are wealthy enough to take us out of the country. And also the measure of success for us as Nigerians was to speak English. Queen's English would even be much better, to pass your mathematics exam. And it doesn't matter that English is not our indigenous language. If you wanted to major in one of the indigenous languages in Nigeria, you would still be required to pass English. Even if you do well in your indigenous language, you would not be able to get ahead. Of course, there are serious inequities in the country as well. Like Dr. Mutamba spoke about, Nigeria has the highest out-of-school population in the world. Currently, I think we're about 13.5 million, which is the largest concentration of out-of-school out-of-school population in the world. And COVID-19, from my opinion, probably did not make any big difference for Nigeria. It only just showed what people were talking about, that there are structural problems. And in trying to cope with COVID-19, it showed again that it's only young people that have more access to power, young people that come from more affluent homes that are able to cope and manage with COVID-19, because they are the ones that had access to electricity. They're the ones that had access to internet. So even though people in public schools had their education being streamed on TV, if you don't have electricity, you can't watch the programs that are being shown on TV. So it's only the people that have parents that can buy data, that have parents that can, put on the generator when there's no electricity, that have a parent that is probably at home to stay with them, or has a parent that can drop them off somewhere or pay an online tutor to keep them busy if parents have to work. So my entry point into social justice essentially is really speaking generally about the need for us to create an education system that will lead to a more dignified continent where Africans don't have to be at the mercy of the world, don't have to be at the mercy of foreign aid actors. And what I find more contradicting about all of this is the fact that young Africans continue to go through school, but schooling isn't doing anything to equip them with both the perspectives and the skill sets that they need to be able to change their communities. What schooling is simply doing for them is preparing them either for the labor force or to leave the country to become customers of the Western education system. So what I have been doing in Unveiling Africa Foundation, I founded Unveiling Africa when I was 19, and I started Unveiling Africa just as a platform for young Africans to be able to get involved in making a difference in their communities. So instead of us having white people trying to save us in universities, I thought it would be helpful for Africans to have a platform where they're learning about their own issues from their own perspective and taking action. Over time, we've evolved to now providing a platform for Africans and social justice interested people to be able to learn about Africa and the world from an African-centered perspective. And the goal ultimately is to be able to influence curriculum reforms, to be able to influence discussions and actions around structural reforms that would lead to equity, not just in the classroom spaces, but also in how teachers are trained to be able to promote equitable spaces and ensure that every young person that comes into the classroom, regardless of their differences, are able to thrive. So I've been doing this by, I started the Unveiling Africa Academy that has been engaging young Africans on learning about their history, and then we're also going to be training teachers in the public school education system, about 400 of them in Lagos. And the hope is that these teachers will then go on to train students in the school system. Currently, history is not a mandatory subject in Nigeria. It was taken out, interestingly, from our curriculum at independence and replaced with social studies. So I'm trying to push back against that by making history a fun, relatable subject that enables young people to be able to engage with their indigenous epistemologies. So from all of this, I want to answer the questions that was presented to us. So what then is the role of activism in the community and in academia? I think one role of activism, I identified 4 roles that activism plays. First, I think, is to be able to shape the conversation. So the mainstream conversations, especially in academia, when it comes to the African context, remains very colonial. So we still talk about Africa as if our journey towards decolonization has begun, and that supposedly started in 1960. But when you take a critical look at the structures that continues to produce the education that I have gone through, where I learned nothing about my context, learned nothing about my history, you would see that the education system continues to serve the colonial masters, even though the colonial masters are physically not on the continent or in Nigeria. So the first thing I think activism must be to shape the conversation, to disrupt the conversation, to ensure that people understand that the discussion.
Sorry very much. You have 3 minutes left.
Okay, sounds good.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So beyond shaping the conversation, activism, I think the other roles of activism is to move the goalposts. So in shaping the conversation, I expect that activism then transforms the conversation. If the starting point about education reform on the continent isn't about providing more access to education, we need to talk about a new purpose of education. We need to talk about a new kind of curriculum. So I think successful activism must do the work of changing the conversation from us talking about sustaining a system that is broken to having a conversation about how do we create new systems that ensures that more young people can graduate from a system that dignifies them and dignifies their ancestors. What does worthwhile and sustainable activism look like? That's the second question. In my opinion, worthwhile and sustainable activism must be interconnected to at least 3 areas of influence. First is the communities in which these concerns come from. Secondly, I think there has to be a strong connection to communities of practice. So who are the practitioners? Who are the teachers? Who are the people out there creating applications, creating programs, designing initiatives for principals? Instructive activism must intersect with everyday practice. And then thirdly, I think instructive, sustainable, worthwhile activism must also connect to policy circles. And I think this should be an iterative process. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Kizoba. Once again, we see the continuation of earlier points. The point of the reproduction of colonialism and oppression in a variety of ways, whether it is in the Middle East or in Africa. You are unfortunately confirming this again. And you give us several examples, including the quote, impressive quote with insights from that student. However, you do not stop there. You have conceptualized the role of the activist. And once again, similar to what Haneen mentioned, we shape the conversation. This is the whole issue of the politics of language, okay? But also you are pushing for activists to have new dreams and new possibilities to get us out of the rut. So thank you very much. Finally, now we move to the fourth speaker, who is Dr. Maria Brown, based in Malta. Maria, you are there?
Yes, I am here. Good evening, everyone. At least here it is evening now.
Maria.
And
right,
thank you
good.
for inviting me.
You are welcome. So a brief introduction to Maria. She holds a PhD in the sociology of adult and non-formal education and community development. She currently lectures in adult education and community-based education within the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Malta. Her research interests include adult education, community action and community development, social equality, sociology, social policy, sustainable development, Europeanization, and issues of methodology, research methods, quantitative and qualitative analysis. Her experience also includes work. Her research experience, that is, includes work for the European Commission, Eurydice, the Council of Europe, the European Cooperation in Science and Technology, and the Ministry for Education and Employment. She has carried out many research projects, including EU-funded projects, and she has published in academic peer-reviewed publications. In her own activist way, Maria, I should say, is a well-known figure in social media in Malta because she has co-produced a program on TV and other, of course, social activities. Maria, the floor is yours. 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So in discussing social justice education in a post-COVID-19 world, my reflections on critical pedagogy, anti-oppressive and decolonial educational perspectives will be primarily informed by 3 sources. First of all, my doctoral studies that I finished in 2015. My doctoral studies focused on adult and community-based education, and particularly in non-formal community settings. And my thesis was entitled Between Domestication and Liberation. As perhaps those of you who are familiar with the works of Paulo Freire, this was informed by a Freirean framework of community-based educational interventions, and the study was situated in Malta. The second source that I will be referring to is a 2-year project in which I participated as one of the key researchers on learner-centered education for adult migrants in Europe. And 4 countries were involved in this research project. These countries cannot really be considered as part of the sub-Saharan African or MENA region, but I will identify the inferences that I find relevant to our discussion tonight. The countries were Scotland, Cyprus, Estonia, and Malta. And the third source is a book review that I published a few years back. And when I was reading our brief for tonight as panelists, it really reminded me of this review that I published in the Malta Review of Educational Research back in 2014. And the book I was reviewing was Alien, Road, and Duib, The Politics of Education Reform in the Middle East, Self and Other in Textbooks and Curricula. So here, the examples that I will mention from this book and my analysis, my review of this book are then contextualized precisely in the Middle East. And to address the first question that we are engaging with tonight, what about the role of activism in the community and the academia? I will start with a quotation from J.P. Green, who is a scholar and researcher heading the Department of Education Reform. So tonight we're talking about what can we do with education in simple words in a post-COVID context. So I was looking back at the works of Green, given also his expertise in education reform. He's based at the University of Arkansas. And in 2011, when COVID was something unknown, he said, education reform thinking is being shaped less and less by books, as we are seeing in other policy areas. Blogs, articles, and other new media are displacing books as the primary means by which intellectual policy movements are formed and sustained. And my emphasis in reading that quote was obviously intended when I was pronouncing blogs, articles, new media, movements, policy movements, because I find these insights as foregrounding our discussion of tonight, unintentionally, of course, but yet quite relevant. And when I was using Green's work in my book review of the publication I mentioned that discusses education reform in the Middle East, I was particularly finding Green's work relevant in reviewing, for example, how broader stakeholders in education need to be acknowledged and roped in. And hence now I am answering directly the question, what about the role of activism in the community of academia? So we need to acknowledge broader stakeholders in education in addressing the concerns and needs of different societal groups and government and civil society institutions. And often from my research as well, also research on vulnerable groups, on civil society activism in various fields, I find that this is, yes, a first step. And in fact, this was pointed out in the publication that I mentioned, that I reviewed by Salah Abdullah Isan, as part of his analysis of schooling in Jordan. But from my research, I realized that this, yes, it's an important first step, but often then one finds that these stakeholders, once identified and perhaps approached, are often not easy to work with. We might all stand for a common goal, or let's say similar goals, but often it is very difficult to facilitate cooperation between these stakeholders because of the different agendas. And sometimes the stakeholders, especially in civil society, might find it difficult to bridge their agendas, what in other research is referred to as bridging social capital. Okay, we might want different things, but we might still form successful networks. And even they might find it difficult to capitalize on bonding social capital. That is, okay, we want the same thing, perhaps we might target it in different ways, but still it is worth investing in our networks. So often, even in my experience within activist group as an activist earlier on in my life, but then also in my research with civil society organizations, I found this problem of civil society organizations starting to drift apart, even though they should stand for the same or similar overarching objectives. And then in the book that I mentioned in the publication on the Middle East on education reform, I had also pointed out at the time when I published the review that in a chapter that was about history education of Lebanese society, the author of this particular chapter, Adhere, had built a case on how history education of Lebanese society by means of the representation of its ethnicities may be deployed to motivate interest in public affairs and political practice, foster a spirit of resistance against oppression and aggression. So here I had at the time, and on reviewing my work of the time, I found this still relevant, the importance of what Freire calls historicity. That is also to be cognizant of history and of what it has led us to, and to be actively participating in the making of that history, to be active actors. And here is how I think academia and activism can be effectively intertwined in fostering this sense of historicity. What forms of activism are more worthwhile and sustainable? In main educational discourse, it has been pointed out that the politics of self and other comes second to economic indicators and quantifiable levels of socio-political modernization as measuring sticks of a country's educational system. Here I am quoting Rhoda and Alayan in the same publication that I mentioned.
Excuse me,
this
Maria.
argument, yes, 2 minutes, I know. This argument, 3 minutes, okay, better. This argument broadens the relevance of a critical inquiry into the neoliberal agenda. And I find that this critical inquiry into the neoliberal agenda is relevant to our discussion tonight. And although perhaps one might say, but this has been repeated over and over again. When I look at the studies that are being carried out and at the research that I'm involved in, this always emerges as a relevant leitmotif. And what recommendations may we therefore develop for activism? I now refer to the research that I carried out with my Scottish, Cypriot, and Estonian partners. We found that adult migrant education can make contributions to democratic citizenship particularly now this time in the EU Mediterranean region and in island and small state context, because our study illuminated the micro-nuanced experiences of adult immigrants and their educators. In some cases, there was comparability of being former colonies, perhaps of the same British Empire. And we found that adult immigrants and their educators were negotiating otherness and the new us with evident and latent conflict and controversy. So the educational initiatives that we were studying yielded evidence of potential largely untapped emancipatory curiosity about otherness and of emancipatory democratic citizenship. And these findings echo pedagogies of liberation discussed at length by Freire and the scholars that he inspired, where epiphanies arise organically within a learning context, thus showing that adult migrant learning spaces can be added to Giroux, to what Henry Giroux lists as new sites of education. And the online education post-COVID context, I am suggesting tonight as these new sites of education as part of the realm of public pedagogy, which Giroux considers crucial to any engagement with any political notion, because these are the sites where people often learn and unlearn, which is also very relevant to our discussion tonight. I am going to stop here with those few pointers, and I welcome, of course, any comments that can help me elaborate on what I have presented so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Again, following the previous speakers, you are reflecting on the role of the intellectual activist. You are introducing a new point here, namely the challenges encountered in concretely involving and dealing with the realities of involving society at large, where, of course, we would expect that there are different views, okay? And how do we bring this together? I think another important point you mentioned is, at least for me, the phrase that you use, the negotiation of otherness and the concept of emancipatory curiosity, and your reflection that connects with previous speakers in terms of the reproduction of colonialism that you are finding within the immigrant experiences themselves, and then, of course, the whole issue of the new sites. But here now, and I suppose I could be the first one to ask a question, what forms do these new sites take? I mean, Haneen has given us an example of a new site, Kizoba the same, Moyo the same, you gave us another one. But what about these new sites via e-learning? I mean, are we assuming that everybody has the possibility of this public new site? I'm just thinking aloud. That is possibly a question that we could consider. A question for the other three presenters, given what you mentioned, Maria, in terms of the challenges of involving stakeholders. Both Haneen, Moyo, and Kizoba have involved different stakeholders. And my question to them is, what has been your experience of involving other stakeholders? Have you encountered the same challenges that Maria has mentioned? Now, so those are two questions. There are two other questions in the question and answer. I'm going to read them. And then Alex has sent another question. So I will read 3 or 4 more questions. And then I will give each of the participants 3 minutes to reflect on any of these questions, okay? Here we have a question from a participant for Moyo, for Dr. Moyo. What strategies does the learning village that you talk about, Moyo, adopt in order to empower learners to be global citizens? to what extent does the community command ownership for the learning village, and how is sustainability of the program ensured? This is from Uyugoga Onuh. Again, also from Uyugoga Onuh, a question for Haneen. Haneen, given your local context, could you please explain how the social emotional stress experienced by the learners were overcome in order to get them inspired and engaged? Another question we have is a general question related to the issue of the right context for social justice education and how to shape the conversation for sustainable activism. Can externals with an activist agenda, well-meaning as they may be, contribute to sustainable solutions, or at least improvements for education in specific contexts? Or should these externals first look for change agents in the specific context and simply play a supporting role, for example, with funding, networking, and so on? So I have given 5 questions here in total. I'm checking the chat. Yes, let me read one more. We have a question for Kizoba, again from Oyegoga Onuch. How diverse is the composition of the African Academy's participants, and what is the scope of operations like? What strategies, if any, are adopted to actively engage education stakeholders from the political and legal systems of Nigeria, particularly in order to guarantee success of the objectives of the movement? Very nice questions. Now, of course, to do justice to all of them, we would need more than 10-15 minutes. So reflections from the participants, going in the same order that we started. So Moyo, you are first, Haneen, Kizoba, and then Maria. Moyo.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Oyegoga Onu. And thank you for the questions, Professor Portelli. I would like to address the first question about strategies the learning village adopt in order to empower learners to be global citizens. Right. So our understanding of global citizens is that these are people that care and act for social justice for the benefit of the world. Not necessarily just people who have information about other parts of the world. So what we do is, one, our curriculum is very social justice centered. So we talk about our responsibility to each other, to the earth, and to everybody that is from anywhere. We also focus on learning about our own African history so that the students can be rooted in their history, continental knowledge, and the place of Africa in the global space. In terms of learning about other spaces, we actually host people from around the world. So we have people from India, have visited people from Japan, the US, Europe, and all of them, we give them an opportunity to interact with the children. So they actually get to meet the children, they actually get to meet the community, and they collaborate in the projects that we are doing. So for example, since March to about June, we had a guest from Israel who came and was a facilitator in one of our adult art programs. And he was there for 3 months. He also taught art and learned our own indigenous art forms from the children and from the adults. We also have partnerships with other organizations. So for example, right now we are partnering with an organization in the States called From Life Pieces, From Pieces to Master, From Pieces life pieces to masterpieces, sorry. And what they do is that they work with Black children and youth around art and life and activism. And so what we're doing is we're doing a video exchange. So our children at Ubuntu will record a video about their own world, and then we send them to life pieces, to masterpieces, and then they also send us our video. So we're doing video pulse, and we're learning from each other in that way. So that gives kind of like a broader understanding of the world, but also really rooted again in social justice. And then in terms of the second question, one of the things that is happening with the challenges in Zimbabwe around education is that there are actually no legal provisions for community school. So the land that the school is on is my own land. And we're in the process of legally changing it so that it's in the name of the trust that has a local community board. And that will allow us then to advocate for a legal provision to have community schools, because right now it's either you have private school or you have government schools and nothing that is community. And the ownership of the learning village is actually in the fact that the people run the school, right? The people in the community, there's a school management board. The people in the community build the school. So we don't pay anybody if someone else in the village can do the work in the school. So from the brick and mortar to feeding the children, to come in and cook for children, cleaning, etc., that is all done by community, and there is no monetary exchange. They're contributing to the education of their children. So that's where the ownership comes from.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mutamba. I am thinking of this now, Moyo. At the very end, would you be kind enough to play us some music? Maybe you want to say no, but all right. Thank you. All right, let's move to Dr. Haneen. Haneen.
Yes. So I want to address the question that was raised, and they were like asking about how my students overcome the challenges, the stress, the emotional stress, and also the political stress. So I have 4 points that I was like thinking and reflecting with my students. First one, it's like, it's okay to feel depressed, and it's okay to feel fear, and it's okay to feel down and you don't have any strength or energy to change. We have, all of us have those days that we feel that we're hopeless. And this is okay, we're normal, we're human beings. And when you're as a teacher or as an educator or as a tutor or even a lecturer, by saying that, you're giving legitimacy to your students to feel those feelings. And when you reflect it, and by the way, I have to mention, I also said to my student, I had difficult week in the middle of the crisis of the pandemic. So I gave example, personal example, that I was depressed. I couldn't move, I couldn't drink. It affected my daily life. I couldn't finish my article. So when they got to hear that, they felt it's okay. This is one. After that, they need to feel that they belong to something bigger. They need to feel that they are part of a community, especially when we were talking about Palestinians, like a minority inside Israel. So you need to feel that you're connected. The minute that you feel that you're part of something bigger, that you're serving a bigger cause, you feel that you have more power and drive to do something immediately the day after. So we lack sometimes this feeling of unity. So the minute you find it, you actually feel that you're saving your own community. And the third thing is, when you have the tools and the ability to change your own destiny and to impact your daily life, you feel that you have hope. You feel that you have ability to influence. And this is giving you, as a humankind, power. You feel that you're motivated too. And the last thing, when you want to bring any change, And that, like an activist, educator, whatever, like you're crossing your mind, if you feel that you're connected to a group of other people who are doing the change, this is an immediate drive. I can give you one example like that now. This is life now. Like I'm looking at everyone here, coming from different places, sharing thoughts, reflecting, and I hear what you say, and I say, okay, this is something that I can do in my class. So when you feel that you have professional, other people who are doing the same exact, the job that you do, and you're actually saving the world, and it's not a metaphor, you're actually driven by that. And I have that circle that I can turn to, consult with, think with, and sometimes to share the challenges and get like, advices. And this is like the 4 points that I wanted to share. And another thing that's related to the question that shared before, it's very important to build partnership. I mean, locally and worldwide. When we were in the like the pandemic, like in the middle of the pandemic crisis, I brought a lot of voices to my classes. I talked with stakeholders. I took to municipalities. I took to activists. I asked my students to bring a remarkable leader in their specific communities. Like when I'm thinking about my Palestinian local communities, it's also diverse. We're not the same. So we have the Bedouin community, we have like this kind of religion, and we have this specific group. So I asked them also to feel that they own the process. So they brought people who leaded the change locally in their neighborhoods, in their towns. And I asked them to bring those voices, those people, to talk to us via Zoom or come personally to the place I teach. And you know what? When they feel that they own the process, they feel also responsible for changing it and taking that to their home. And this is what I want as an educator. So that's it, I guess. You're on mute, Joan.
Thank you, Haneen. Let's move to Kizoba and then Maria, and then we'll try to conclude in some ways. Yes, Kizoba?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So on Oyigoga's question, how diverse is the composition of the Rain Africa's Academy's participants, and what is the scope of operations like? So this is the second year we're running the program, and we've had participants from every part of the world, really. And the participants haven't only been Africans. We've had people from Saudi Arabia, from Canada, the US, of course, Nigeria. We've had people from the UK. We've also, breaking that even further, most of the demographics of the first year, we had lots of teachers from a particular teaching organization here in Nigeria participate in the program. Just also had lots of young people that are, very interested in social issues, interested in politics, participate. We find that a lot of Africans in diaspora or people that are interested or, participating in programs in diaspora that calls for social justice, inclusion, tend to have a very strong interest in the work. So I hope moving forward, we're registered in Nigeria and also in Canada, but we need to figure out how we can institutionalize or get this work to shape institutional programs in Canada. Here in Nigeria, we know that the low-hanging fruit for us, or what we must try to do to be able to start to influence the experiences of young people in schools, is to be able to try to hold on to history as a curriculum subject, which is available or an option for young people in senior secondary school, but it's called social studies in junior secondary school. So now we're attempting to train history teachers and social studies teachers, and what we're saying is that history doesn't have to be taught in a boring way that is just theoretical. So we're providing an opportunity for young people to be able to go to museums, meet people that have these histories that we want to teach. So one-on-one interaction, not just reading books. Young people also being involved in gathering history from their own communities and from their own families and bringing that into the space. So we want to train teachers to be able to do that. So we're in conversations with Lagos State government, and we've gotten into a collaboration with the teaching network here in Nigeria. What strategies do we have to engage education stakeholders from political and legal systems of Nigeria? One of the key approaches that I adopt for this program is that history is not just knowledge that is tucked in a book. I want to, and I think this is something that we learned a lot when I was in school, where we talked about ourselves as critical sites of knowledge. And within the African context, we often talk about old people being moving libraries. So in some of the models that we work with, so the curriculum broadly is divided into 5 historical eras. So one is the movement for democracy on the continent, the quest for independence. So in those models, I've tried, and also the Nigerian Civil War is another one. In those models, I try to invite people that fought in the war, for example, people that the activists that were on the front line, fighting for our democracy on the continent. So you find that a lot of the people that were involved in the democracy movement are now prominent lawyers in Nigeria or prominent politicians on the African context. So that's one strategy that, without thinking too much about it, just wanting the program to be more practical than theoretical, I just have to always engage people that are actively working in the political and the legal space. Does this in any way guarantee the success of the movement? I'm not sure. I think what it does is that it helps people to be able to see knowledge as not just something that is trapped in a book. It helps them to now, get on their own learning journeys, to be able to engage other people that look like the people that we brought into the classroom to teach. I also wanted to answer the question from Dr. Alex on externals with an activist agenda. One of the things that I feel is critically important, at least in my own approach, and what I found to be missing within the African context is the centering of the voices of the people that actually have the lived experiences of what exactly is going on. So you find within the African context, for example, the experts are often the people in the World Bank, the people in UNESCO, people that for them, the things that we're talking about are just theoretical research papers for them. While when you talk to students, for example, who have gone through the system and have still not learned anything about their immediate context, but have the passion to want to change the world, you completely get a different response, a different definition of what the problem is. So for any external actor that is truly interested in wanting to make a difference, I think your ultimate goal should be to make yourself become irrelevant, such that, once the problem is solved and people don't need you, then you've really done a good job. And so what this looks like for me is that you must identify people on the ground that are already working on the issues that you're interested in, and identify how your interest, first of all, identify if your interest is even valid, and then try to intersect it within what people on the ground are doing. And yes, funding is fantastic and helpful. Networking is fantastic. But what I think is important is that the people on the ground are given the legitimacy that they deserve for the work they've been doing, and are allowed to champion the issues that they see on a daily basis. And ultimately, what happens is that, you know, the people on the ground are able to shape the issues in a more pertinent way that is relevant to people around them, but they are also able to gain more social capital in the process of solving this problem. And ultimately, I think any useful solution, you should be able to measure the success by the improvements in the lives of the people on the ground, not by evaluating how much more robust, you know, your CV as this external actor has become. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Imoka. Okay, Dr. Brown, last but not least, and then I have to conclude because we're already about 10 minutes beyond. Yeah? Any further reflections, Maria, on the questions?
Well, I am concerned about the issue of sustainability primarily. And
okay.
Perhaps I will just identify some
which is a very
potential
fair concern.
weaknesses.
It's a very fair concern.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because in the light of what the other panelists are saying, I cannot ignore findings of research that I have been involved in, where, for example, research on education for sustainable development in Malta, educational sustainable development, where the contributors are civil society entities. We found, for example, evidence of what we refer to as a culture of inertia, because there was a certain point where, although goodwill notwithstanding, it's very similar to what Dr. Alex Grech perhaps is referring to in his question. We found that there is a certain point where there is confusion about what education for sustainable development means, uncoordinated efforts, perhaps reinventing the wheel, and a lot of energy and funding are not wasted, but they could be used in a more efficient way. And I also refer to another research study where that I was involved in on the possibility of having a policy on community involvement that, of course, would factor in civil society organizations, community involvement in state primary schools in Malta. And amongst the limitations that were identified vis-a-vis this possibility of having a policy to support community involvement, civil society activism, even in the state primary school as a site, for a physical site for education, and now also an online site in a post-COVID world. We found limitations such as, for example, most research participants said that there isn't evidence of the long-term commitment from community participants. It could be more the case of having spurious contributions that are still relevant, but to ask civil society contributors to be committed on a long term is often a challenge. So there is the risk of tokenism. Potentially reconcilable agendas that I mentioned as well in my earlier presentation. And they also mentioned limitations, for example, irresponsible use of school resources, or perhaps uncoordinated use of educational resources. So these are among the challenges that the participants that were contributing to this research study were mentioning, that at least in Malta, there is evidence that we still have not overcome. But although I am very much inspired by the examples and the testimonials of my colleagues.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, wherever I have worked, Maria, the issue of sustainability is always an issue, okay? But maybe, Alex, this is is another area as a follow-up among many other ones that I think we need to pursue further with 3CL. From each of these sessions, we had several follow-ups. Now, before I conclude, there is an anonymous attendee who wrote a lengthy comment and question, okay? 2 points that are being raised here. The whole issue of shaming from people who do work in social justice education. Let me be upfront. The purpose of identifying problems within a system is not to shame people, but it is simply as part of a lifelong process where we have to be honest with ourselves, identify the problems, call them as they are: colonial, oppressive, white privilege, racist, sexist, whatever the case may be. And the point is not to shame, the point is to identify a problematic and then together work towards resolving and moving ahead with a new conceptual framework that does not reproduce those problems themselves. The person ends with a question. Can you offer an example of educational context where accountability is taught and or demonstrated in social justice education? There are many examples where this can happen. I think the examples that at least 3 of the participants mentioned today are clear examples of those things. Now, the question becomes, what do we mean by accountability is taught? For me, accountability is not counting numbers. Accountability is developing a moral responsibility towards oneself, towards others, and towards the community at large. And to do this, of course, with the purpose of bringing about a better well-being, a healthier life, a life that is empowering rather than oppressive. But there are many examples that one can offer even in the literature itself. Okay, so before I thank all the people concerned, I want to end this session, and of course, which is at the very end of all our sessions, with a very short quote from a long poem by a Palestinian American poet, and her name is Suhar Hamad. If you haven't heard of Suhar Hamad, search her out. And in a longer poem, she writes, quote, "If I say nothing, I am complicit. If I say something, I'm isolated as extreme, as a theorist in conspiracy, as if war is ever a coincidence, as if genocide simply happens." To me, this quote gives me the hope for new possibilities and gives me the energy to continue to work with people like yourselves with the aim to actively bring about change with social justice in mind, because, of course, nothing is a coincidence. And therefore, we have to actively plan together. So thank you, Dr. Maria Brown. Thank you, Dr. Kizoba Imoka from Nigeria, Maria Brown from Malta. Thank you, Moyo Mutamba from Zimbabwe, but now in Canada. Thank you, Hanin Majdali, Palestinian in Israel. And thank you to 3CL and Alex and Gabriella Cassola, who is working so well and you know, with lots of energy behind the scene. Alex, maybe you want to have the last word as the director. And Moyo, are you going to play for us? And thank you to the participants.
I'll try.
Okay, Alex.
Okay, I can't claim to be playing any instrument, but I'll just make one point. I'm in the business of trying to get things done in my life. I've reached that stage now. I've written enough policy papers for various governments. I remember working for a project for the MasterCard Foundation on what to do in Africa. And I think the question I've had at the back of my mind is this enough? Is this connecting people, which is what we do now on a regular basis? We've been doing this for the last 3 years. Is this enough, connecting people from different parts of the world to talk about common issues? I think the one thing we're increasingly convinced about is that we need local solutions for local problems. And I really like the idea of that you need to engage with people on the ground and find a way of increasing the social capital as a way of having something more sustainable. Because just doing a webinar like this, filming it, putting it online, and then hoping for the best, is not enough. So again, this is a genuine, not an offer, it's really what we're doing. If people want to find some way of tapping not just into our networks, please do. We're also looking for people on the ground who are trying to get things done and finding some way of helping out not in the white, looking good kind of thing, KPI kind of world, which is what John was implying. That's not what we're trying to do. Even though clearly everybody's accountable for everybody, for every single cent that we have. Okay, so that's what I wanted to leave you with. This idea of, I think, of local solutions. I learned quite a lot today, and I think in the same way that Haneen was saying, there's things happening in Africa, and you can relate to them in Palestine and in Israel, and just connecting the dots. I think this is the one thing I always go away with from these kind of sessions. And onto that, go for the music, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. The participants can continue to talk a bit afterwards, if you wish, as a debrief. I have to run because I need to get something urgent from a pharmacy, and it closes in 10 minutes, okay? So I will only join you for 2 minutes. Moyo.
All right. I'll play you a song. This is the instrument, Bira, a song called Mukatiende, which is a call to action. When everything happens because of action.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Moyo. Thank you all. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.
You can continue.
Bye. Thank you.
I will be sending you an email individually, but